The gentle hum of JFK's Terminal 4 wrapped around Michael Thompson like a familiar blanket. 20 years of flying had taught him to find comfort in the rhythmic chaos of airports, but today was different. Instead of his crisp captain's uniform, he wore a charcoal cashmere sweater and tailored black slacks. His pilot's wings, usually gleaming on his chest, rested safely in his leather messenger bag alongside his latest read, Breaking Through the Clouds, A History of Aviation Pioneers. The first-class lounge buzzed with the quiet conversations of business travelers and wealthy tourists. Michael sank into one of the plush leather chairs, savoring the rare opportunity to experience flight from the other side of the cockpit door. Flight AA-2537 to Los Angeles would be his first time flying as a passenger in years, a necessary trip to attend the aviation safety conference. As he immersed himself in his book, the subtle shift in atmosphere was almost imperceptible at first. A woman in a Chanel suit glanced his way, then quickly averted her eyes. A businessman clutched his briefcase a little tighter. Michael had grown accustomed to these microaggressions over his 15 years as a commercial pilot, but they still left a bitter taste in his mouth. Now boarding first-class passengers for American Airlines Flight 2537 to Los Angeles, the gate agent announced, her voice carrying across the terminal. Michael gathered his belongings and joined the priority boarding line. The weight of his pilot's ID card in his pocket felt reassuring, a small reminder of his earned place in the sky. As he approached the gate, he noticed the slight hesitation in the agent's smile, the momentary flicker of surprise in her eyes as she scanned his first-class ticket. The familiar scent of recycled air and new upholstery greeted him as he stepped onto the aircraft. Lisa John, the lead flight attendant, stood at the entrance, her professional smile faltering slightly as she glanced between Michael and his boarding pass. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Michael handed it over, recognizing the familiar dance of doubt he'd experienced countless times before. Lisa studied the ticket with unusual intensity, her perfectly manicured fingers tapping against the paper. "I'm sorry, sir, but there seems to be some confusion," she said, lowering her voice. "We appear to be experiencing an overbooking situation in first class. Would you mind taking a seat in economy for now? We'll sort this out before takeoff." The cabin air suddenly felt thicker, heavier. Michael could feel the eyes of other first-class passengers, watching the exchange with mixed expressions of curiosity and discomfort. A young executive typed furiously on his phone, pretending not to notice, while an elderly couple whispered behind their hands. "I understand," Michael replied, his voice steady and measured. "However, before I move, I'd like to speak with the captain." Lisa's professional veneer cracked slightly, revealing a flash of annoyance. "Sir, the flight crew is very busy with pre-flight procedures." "I insist," Michael said firmly, yet politely. "It's important." The tension in the air was palpable as Lisa disappeared behind the cockpit door. Michael stood in the galley, his hand resting on the back of a first-class seat, acutely aware of the murmurs and stares around him. He thought about his father, who had worked as a mechanic for Pan Am in the 1970s, dreaming of the day his son would fly the planes he maintained. The old man had always said, "Son, sometimes you have to stand your ground without losing your grace." Behind him, a young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is that man just standing there?" The mother quickly shushed her daughter, but the innocent question hung in the air like a spotlight on the absurdity of the situation. The cockpit door opened, and First Officer David Martinez stepped out. His eyes widened in recognition. "Captain Thompson, what's going on out here?" The revelation sent a ripple through the cabin. Lisa's face drained of color as she realized her mistake. The whispers among the passengers took on a different tone, and the young executive finally looked up from his phone, his expression a mix of shock and embarrassment. "There seems to be some confusion about my seat assignment," Michael said calmly, meeting David's concerned gaze. "I thought it best to speak with the flight crew directly." David turned to Lisa, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Miss John, Captain Thompson is one of our most senior pilots. He's been with American Airlines for 15 years and has over 20,000 flight hours. There is no overbooking situation." The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her passenger manifest. I'm so sorry, Captain Thompson. I didn't realize. That's part of the problem, isn't it? Michael replied softly, ensuring his words carried to those nearby. We never realize our assumptions until they're laid bare. David placed a supportive hand on Michael's shoulder. Captain Reynolds isn't feeling well today. Would you consider taking command of this flight? Michael's response was interrupted by the arrival of his uniform, rushed to the gate by ground crew who had been notified of the situation. As he changed in the crew rest area, he could hear the murmur of conversations in the cabin, the sound of consciousness being raised, of perspectives shifting like tectonic plates. When he emerged in his captain's uniform, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. The same passengers who had watched his humiliation now sat straighter in their seats, some unable to meet his eye, others offering apologetic smiles. The young girl who had questioned his presence earlier beamed with excitement. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael's voice carried clearly through the cabin as he stood at the front of the first-class section. I'm Captain Michael Thompson, and I'll be commanding your flight to Los Angeles today. Before we begin our journey, I want to share something with you. The cabin fell silent, every ear tuned to his words, every eye fixed on his commanding presence. In that moment, Michael knew that this flight would be more than just a journey across the country. It would be a lesson in humanity that none of them would soon forget. Chapter 2. The beginning of a confrontation. The pre-flight checks proceeded with practiced precision, but the atmosphere in the cockpit crackled with unspoken tension. David Martinez handled the radio communications while Michael reviewed the flight plan, their usual easy camaraderie temporarily replaced by a weighted silence. Through the cockpit door, they could hear the continued murmur of passengers boarding, the thump of bags being stored, and the occasional burst of conversation about what had transpired. The incident had sparked something, turning a routine transcontinental flight into a crucible of social consciousness. I've known Lisa for 3 years, David finally said, his voice low as he adjusted the altimeter setting. She's usually one of our best. Michael's fingers moved steadily over the instrument panel, each switch and dial familiar as his own heartbeat. Sometimes our best isn't good enough if it's built on a foundation of unconscious bias. In the main cabin, Lisa moved through her duties like a sleepwalker, her usual confidence shattered. Each time she passed the cockpit, her steps quickened, as if trying to escape the gravity of her actions. The other flight attendants had picked up the slack, their efficiency tinged with awkward awareness of the situation. A soft knock on the cockpit door interrupted their preparations. Karen Williams, the airline's chief purser, stepped inside, her expression grave. Captain Thompson, I've just been briefed about what happened. The station manager wants to know if you'd like to file a formal complaint. Michael paused, his hand hovering over the weather radar display. Through the cockpit windows, he could see the ground crew preparing for pushback, their orange vests bright against the gray tarmac. In the distance, other planes took off into the afternoon sky, their contrails painting white lines across the blue canvas. No, he said finally, but I would like to address the passengers before we take off. Karen nodded, relief and respect mingling in her expression. Of course, Captain, whenever you're ready. As she left, David turned to Michael. You're handling this better than most would. My father used to say that change doesn't come from pushing people down, but from lifting them up to see a better view. Michael checked the final items on his pre-flight checklist. Besides, we're about to have 300 people captive at 35,000 feet. Sometimes the best classroom is one you can't walk out of. In the first-class cabin, passengers had settled into an uneasy quiet. The young executive who had ignored the earlier confrontation now sat with his laptop closed, lost in thought. The elderly couple whispered together, occasionally glancing toward the cockpit with expressions of shame and curiosity. Lisa stood in the galley, mechanically arranging drinks for takeoff. Her hands shook slightly as she lined up plastic cups, each clink a reminder of her mistake. Karen approached her, speaking in low, firm tones about professionalism and accountability. The boarding door closed with a heavy thud, sealing them all together in their aluminum classroom. Michael took a deep breath, adjusted his uniform tie, and reached for the public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. His voice filled the cabin, steady and clear. Before we depart for Los Angeles, I'd like to take a moment to talk about something that happened during boarding. The cabin fell silent, phones lowered, conversations stopped mid-sentence. In economy class, passengers leaned forward, straining to hear every word. A child's question, "Mommy, what's he talking about?" was quickly hushed. Earlier today, I boarded this flight as a passenger in first class. Some of you witnessed what followed. I was asked to move to economy, not because of overbooking, but because I didn't fit someone's image of a first-class passenger. Or, as it turns out, their image of a pilot. He paused, letting the words sink in. Through the cockpit door, he could hear the sharp intake of breath from several passengers, the rustle of discomfort, the murmur of recognition. I'm sharing this not to shame anyone, but because we have a choice in this moment. We can let this incident fade into the background like so many others, or we can use it as an opportunity to examine our own assumptions and biases. In the galley, Lisa had stopped her preparations, standing perfectly still as she listened. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I've been flying for 20 years, Michael continued. "I've navigated through storms, handled emergencies, and brought thousands of passengers safely to their destinations. None of those things have anything to do with the color of my skin, yet here we are, still having this conversation in 2024. The young girl who had questioned his presence earlier tugged at her mother's sleeve again. "Mom, is the pilot saying people were mean to him because he's different?" The mother drew her daughter close, whispering explanations that would shape another generation's understanding. "In a few moments, we'll take off for Los Angeles. For the next 5 hours, we'll be sharing this space, breathing the same air, experiencing the same journey. I'll be responsible for your safety regardless of who you are or what you believe. That's my job, and I do it with pride." David watched his captain with quiet admiration, noting how the words seemed to physically move through the cabin, touching each passenger in turn. "So I ask you to think about this. What other assumptions might we be carrying? What other barriers are we creating based on nothing more than our own limited perspectives? The view from 35,000 feet has taught me that the world looks very different when you rise above the clouds of prejudice." The silence that followed his words was profound, heavy with reflection and realization. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the aircraft, someone began to applaud. The sound spread like a wave, building into a thunderous expression of support and understanding. As the applause died down, Michael switched off the PA system and turned to his flight controls. "David, let's get these people to Los Angeles." The engines spun up with a familiar whine, but today their power seemed to carry more than just thrust. They carried the weight of change, the momentum of minds opening, the lift of spirits rising above their own limitations. As they taxied toward the runway, Michael caught a glimpse of his reflection in the windscreen. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Son, sometimes the highest you'll ever fly isn't measured in feet." The tower cleared them for takeoff, and as the plane lifted into the afternoon sky, 300 passengers began a journey that would take them far beyond their intended destination. As Flight AA-2537 climbed through the clouds, the cabin settled into a contemplative silence. Michael guided the aircraft with practiced ease, his hands steady on the controls as they ascended through layers of cotton-white cumulus. The afternoon sun painted the wingtips in brilliant gold, a stark contrast to the darker moments that had marked their departure. In the main cabin, Lisa moved through her service duties with mechanical precision, though her usual warmth had been replaced by a haunted look in her eyes. Each time she passed a passenger, her smile wavered with the weight of her earlier actions. The young executive who had ignored the boarding incident now watched her intently, perhaps seeing for the first time the human cost of silent complicity. At cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dimmed, and the cabin came alive with subtle movement. Passengers shifted in their seats, some reaching for phones or laptops, others simply staring out their windows at the endless blue expanse. In row 12, an elderly woman gently touched Lisa's arm as she passed with the beverage cart. "We all make mistakes, dear," she said softly. "It's what we learn from them that matters." Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she poured a ginger ale, the ice cubes clicking against the plastic cup like tiny bells. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I just can't believe I—" "Sometimes our worst moments become our best teachers," the woman continued, her weathered hands accepting the drink. "I remember when I first started teaching in the 60s, the things I thought I knew, the assumptions I made. Lord, how far we've come, and yet, in first class, the atmosphere had shifted from earlier tension to something more introspective. A businessman in 2A had removed his AirPods, engaging in quiet conversation with his seatmate about their own experiences with prejudice. The young girl who had questioned Michael's presence earlier was now drawing a picture of an airplane, carefully coloring the pilot's uniform with a brown crayon. David handled the radio communications with air traffic control, stealing occasional glances at his captain. Michael's face remained serene, focused on the task at hand, but his eyes held a depth of thought that spoke volumes. The white noise of the engines provided a constant backdrop to their shared silence, a reminder of the power and responsibility they held in their hands. 3 hours into the flight, Karen approached the cockpit with a stack of napkins in her hands. "Captain Thompson," she said, her voice catching slightly, "the passengers, they've been writing messages. Would you like to see them?" Michael accepted the impromptu notes, each one penned in different handwriting, carrying words of apology, support, and gratitude. One message, written in the shaky hand of the elderly woman in row 12, particularly caught his eye. "Thank you for showing us what dignity looks like at 35,000 feet." As they crossed over the Rockies, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the snow-capped peaks below, Lisa finally found the courage to approach the cockpit during a quiet moment. Her knock was tentative, almost inaudible above the engine noise. "Come in," Michael called, recognizing the moment for what it was, a chance for healing. Lisa stepped inside, her professional demeanor cracking like thin ice under spring sun. "Captain Thompson," she began, then stopped, emotions threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. "I don't even know where to begin." "Begin with tomorrow," Michael suggested gently, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Begin with what you'll do differently when you see someone who doesn't match your expectations." A patch of turbulence rattled the aircraft, causing Lisa to grip the back of David's seat. The physical shakiness mirrored her emotional state, but she stood her ground. "I've been in aviation for 12 years, she said, her voice steadying. "I thought I was better than this. I thought." "We all think we're better than our biases," Michael replied, adjusting the altitude slightly to find smoother air. "The trick is recognizing them when they surface. It's like flying through weather. You can't avoid every storm, but you can learn to navigate through them." The sun continued its westward journey, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and purple. Below, the landscape transitioned from mountains to desert, the terrain a patchwork of colors that ignored human-made boundaries and prejudices. In the cabin, passengers had begun sharing their own stories, the incident at boarding having opened a channel for honest conversation. A young college student in economy class had started a thread on social media about the experience, her posts gaining traction with each passing minute. #dignity at 35,000 feet was trending, carrying their story far beyond the confines of their aluminum classroom. As they began their descent into Los Angeles, the city lights sprawling below them like a galaxy of earthbound stars, Michael's voice came over the PA system one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach into LAX. Looking back on our journey today, I'm reminded that the true measure of distance isn't just in miles traveled, but in minds changed and hearts opened. Thank you for being part of this lesson in humanity." The cabin responded with spontaneous applause, more heartfelt than polite, more understanding than perfunctory. Lisa stood in the galley, tears flowing freely now, but her smile was genuine for the first time since departure. The elderly woman in row 12 reached for her seatmate's hand, squeezing it in silent acknowledgement of the moment's significance. David handled the landing checklist with precise efficiency, but his voice carried a note of pride as he confirmed each item. "Landing gear down and locked," he reported, then added quietly, "It's been an honor, Captain." The lights of Los Angeles grew larger, brighter, more defined as they descended through the evening sky. Michael guided the aircraft with the same skill and confidence he always did, but tonight felt different. Tonight, He wasn't just landing a plane, he was bringing a transformation to ground level, where it could take root and grow. As the wheels touched down on runway 24L, the gentle bump of rubber meeting concrete felt like a period at the end of a profound sentence. The aircraft rolled out smoothly, its speed bleeding away as they taxied toward their gate. But the momentum of change they had generated showed no signs of slowing. The terminal building grew larger in their windscreen, its lights welcoming them back to Earth. But for the 300 souls on board Flight AA-2537, their true destination had already been reached, a place of greater understanding where assumptions were challenged, biases confronted, and dignity prevailed. As the parking brake engaged and the engine spooled down, Michael sat for a moment in the growing quiet. He thought of his father, of the dreams that had seemed so distant on those long-ago days when they watched planes take off together. He thought of the young girl with her brown crayon, drawing a future where such dreams wouldn't seem so impossible to others. The cabin door opened to the warm California evening, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. As passengers began to gather their belongings, their conversations were different from the usual end-of-flight chatter. Phone numbers were exchanged, connections made, perspectives permanently altered. Lisa stood at the door, meeting each passenger's eyes as they deplaned, her gratitude and remorse evident in every thank you and goodbye. When the elderly woman from row 12 passed, she pressed a small piece of paper into Lisa's hand. "My classroom address," she explained. "When you're ready to share your story, my students would love to hear it." The young executive who had ignored the initial confrontation was one of the last to leave. He stopped at the cockpit door, where Michael was completing his post-flight checks. "Captain," he said, extending his hand, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier. I run a corporate training company, and, well, would you be interested in sharing your experience with our clients?" As the last passengers departed and the cleaning crew began their work, Michael stood in the empty cabin, absorbing the lingering energy of transformation. The setting sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows that reminded him of the distance they had traveled, not just across the country, but across the landscape of human consciousness. Tomorrow, this flight would become a story, shared in break rooms and boardrooms, classrooms and living rooms. It would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond those who had experienced it firsthand. But for now, in the quiet of the empty cabin, Michael simply smiled, knowing that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that change us on the inside. He gathered his belongings, nodding to the cleaning crew as he made his way toward the terminal. Behind him, Flight AA-2537 stood silent, its aluminum skin cooling in the evening air, unaware of its role in a journey that had transcended mere transportation. Above, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, eternal witnesses to humanity's ongoing flight toward understanding. As Michael stepped into the terminal, the bustling energy of LAX wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The events of the flight still resonated in his mind, but the story was far from over. His phone buzzed with notifications. The hashtag dignity at 35,000 feet had exploded across social media, with thousands sharing their own experiences of prejudice in the aviation industry and beyond. The next morning, as dawn painted the Los Angeles skyline in shades of pink and gold, Michael sat in his hotel room preparing for the aviation safety conference. His inbox overflowed with messages from colleagues, industry leaders, and media outlets. The airline CEO had left 3 voicemails, each more urgent than the last. But it was a different message that caught his attention. An email from a high school teacher in Brooklyn, sharing how her students had been inspired by his story. They had started a project called Breaking Barriers, documenting instances of everyday prejudice and the quiet heroes who stood against them. "Your actions reminded us that leadership isn't just about authority," she wrote. "It's about transforming difficult moments into opportunities for growth." The conference hall buzzed with anticipation when Michael arrived. What was supposed to be a routine presentation on safety protocols had evolved into something more profound. Pilots, flight attendants, and airline executives approached him throughout the day, each carrying their own stories of bias and revelation. During his keynote speech, Michael deviated from his prepared remarks about mechanical systems and emergency procedures. Instead, he spoke about a different kind of safety, the emotional security of knowing you'll be judged by your abilities, not your appearance. Aviation has always been about breaking barriers, he told the packed auditorium. We broke the sound barrier, the altitude barrier, the distance barrier. But some barriers aren't measured in physics, they're measured in perceptions. And those are often the hardest to break. Back at the airline's headquarters, Lisa had begun working with the Human Resources Department to develop new training protocols. Her experience became a case study in unconscious bias, and her willingness to acknowledge and learn from her mistake made her an unexpected advocate for change. The elderly woman from row 12, who turned out to be Dr. Margaret Chen, a retired professor of sociology, had already incorporated the flight's events into her guest lectures at local universities. Her students were particularly moved by the intersection of privilege, power, and redemption that played out at 35,000 feet. The young executive followed through on his offer. Michael began receiving invitations to speak at corporate events where he shared his story not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to the power of dignified resistance. His father's words about standing ground without losing grace became a mantra for workplace diversity initiatives. The young girl who had drawn the brown-skinned pilot wrote him a letter, complete with more crayon illustrations. "When I grow up," she wrote in careful first-grade handwriting, "I want to be a pilot like you. My teacher says I can be anything, and now I know it's true." Months later, American Airlines launched a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program, specifically addressing the subtle biases that had plagued the industry for decades. Lisa, having found her voice as an advocate for change, became one of its most effective trainers. Her honesty about her own failings resonated with employees at all levels. The story continued to ripple outward. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies and training procedures. Aviation schools reported an uptick in applications for minority students. Industry publications ran features on diversity in aviation, many citing Flight AA-2537 as a turning point in the conversation. David Martinez, the first officer who had stood by Michael that day, was promoted to captain. At his ceremony, he spoke about the courage it takes to confront bias, not just in others, but in oneself. Sometimes the most important course corrections, he said, happen on the ground. A year after the flight, Michael stood before a new class of pilot trainees at the airline's training center. The faces before him reflected a changing industry, diverse, determined, and ready to soar. On the wall behind him hung a framed napkin, its handwritten message still clear. "Thank you for showing us what dignity looks like at 35,000 feet." The story of Flight AA-2537 became more than just a viral moment or a corporate case study. It became a reminder that change doesn't always come through grand gestures or loud proclamations. Sometimes it comes through quiet dignity, through standing firm while remaining gracious, through turning moments of prejudice into opportunities for growth. As Michael prepared for his next flight, striding through the terminal in his captain's uniform, he noticed something different. The looks he received were no longer of surprise or suspicion, but of recognition and respect, not just for his rank or position, but for the change he had helped create. His father's words about flying high took on new meaning. The true altitude of human achievement isn't measured in feet or meters, but in the heights we reach when we rise above our prejudices, when we lift each other up instead of holding each other down. The skies above remained as vast and blue as ever, but the path through them had been forever changed. Each contrail now carried not just the dreams of flight, but the promise of a future where dignity and respect soared above the clouds of prejudice, where every person could reach their full potential, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. And somewhere, in a first-grade classroom, a young girl with a brown crayon continued to draw pilots who looked like her, her dreams no longer limited by the color of her skin or the boundaries of others' expectations. The story of Flight AA-2537 had become her story too, a tale of possibility passed down to the next generation of dreamers and doers. For Michael, each takeoff became a reminder of that transformative flight, each landing a new opportunity to touch down on the runway of progress. The journey toward true equality might be long, but like any good pilot, he knew that the most important thing was staying on course, keeping a steady hand on the controls, and never losing sight of the horizon ahead. The end of this story was really just the beginning, a beginning written in contrails across the sky, in changed minds and open hearts, in the quiet triumph of dignity over discrimination. And as Michael lifted off for another flight, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful changes happen not in grand moments of confrontation, but in the gentle persistence of grace under pressure, in the steady flight path toward a better tomorrow. The steady flight path toward a better tomorrow became more than just a metaphor. 2 years after the transformative flight AA-2537, Michael found himself addressing the United Nations Aviation Council, sharing his story with representatives from airlines across the globe. The small moment of prejudice that could have remained hidden in the confines of an aircraft cabin had blossomed into a worldwide movement for change in the aviation industry. The airline's diversity program, now known as Above Prejudice, had been adopted by carriers in 37 countries. Lisa Chun had become its global ambassador, her personal journey from bias to awareness resonating with aviation professionals worldwide. She no longer carried shame in her story, but wielded it as a powerful tool for transformation. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from David Martinez, who now headed the airline's pilot recruitment initiative. "You need to see this," the message read, followed by a link to a news article. The piece featured a graduating class from the Air Force Academy, the most diverse in its history. In the front row, beaming with pride, stood a familiar face. The young girl from Flight AA-2537, now a teenager, well on her way to achieving her pilot dreams. Dr. Margaret Chin had published a book titled Lessons at Altitude: How One Flight Changed Aviation's Culture. The chapter featuring Lisa's story had become required reading in flight attendant training programs worldwide. Airlines began to understand that safety wasn't just about mechanical systems and emergency procedures. It was about creating an environment where every passenger and crew member felt secure, respected, and valued. The young executive who had witnessed Michael's dignity that day had transformed his corporate training company into a leading consultancy for diversity and inclusion. Their signature program, the Thompson Protocol, helped organizations identify and address unconscious bias before it could manifest in discriminatory actions. But perhaps the most profound change was happening in the quiet moments, in the daily interactions that made up the fabric of aviation life. Gone were the surprised looks when passengers saw a pilot of color step into the cockpit. The questions about qualifications had been replaced by respect for expertise. The industry was finally beginning to reflect the diversity of the skies it navigated. Michael's father's words about standing ground without losing grace had become a mantra for a new generation of aviation professionals. His simple wisdom had transcended the personal moment of father and son to become a guiding principle for an entire industry in transformation. One particularly memorable morning, as Michael prepared for a flight to Tokyo, a young black flight attendant approached him in the terminal. "Captain Thompson," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I started flying because of your story, but now I stay because of how you changed the sky for all of us." The terminals of the world's airports had become more than just transit points. They were now spaces where prejudice was actively challenged, where assumptions were questioned before they could take root. The hashtag dignity at 35,000 feet had evolved into a global movement, with aviation professionals sharing stories of triumph over bias, of barriers broken, of horizons expanded. Lisa's training sessions now included a powerful moment where she would hold up the napkin notes from that fateful flight, preserved and framed, as a reminder that change often begins with the courage to acknowledge our mistakes and the determination to do better. The brown crayon drawing from the young first grader had been reproduced on posters that hung in flight schools across the country, inspiring a new generation to reach for the stars regardless of their background. This simple artwork had become a symbol of possibility, a reminder that dreams know no color. As Michael guided his aircraft into the rising sun, he reflected on how a single moment of confrontation, kindled with dignity and grace, had sparked a revolution in the skies. The contrails behind him were no longer just vapor trails marking his passage through the atmosphere. They were pathways of possibility for countless others who would follow. The industry's transformation hadn't been without turbulence. There were still pockets of resistance, still moments when old biases tried to reassert themselves. But like any good pilot, the aviation community had learned to navigate through rough air while keeping sight of their destination. A future where the only barriers were those of physics, not prejudice. The story of Flight AA-2537 continued to be told, not as a cautionary tale of discrimination, but as a testament to the power of dignified resistance and graceful transformation. It had become part of aviation folklore, passed down from seasoned captains to wide-eyed trainees. A reminder that the most important journeys often begin with a single act of courage. In flight schools across the world, students now learn not just about lift and thrust, but about the uplifting power of dignity and the forward thrust of progress. The technical aspects of aviation were paired with lessons in humanity, creating pilots who were skilled not just in flying planes, but in elevating the human spirit. Michael's father had passed away the previous year, but his legacy lived on in every pilot who faced prejudice with grace, in every flight attendant who challenged their own biases, in every passenger who witnessed the sky becoming a more inclusive space. His simple wisdom about standing ground had become the foundation for an industry-wide revolution. As the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky, Michael thought about all the lives touched by that single flight, all the careers transformed, all the dreams unleashed. The story hadn't ended. It had multiplied, fractal-like, into thousands of individual journeys toward justice and understanding. The horizon ahead was no longer just a line where sky met earth. It was a boundary constantly pushing forward, expanding the possibilities for all who dared to fly. And in the contrails that crisscrossed the globe, in the jet streams that connected continents, in the airways that united humanity, the spirit of dignity at 35,000 feet continued to soar, touching lives and lifting hearts, one flight at a time. As the spirit of dignity at 35,000 feet continued to soar, the aviation industry underwent an even more profound transformation. 5 years after Flight AA-2537, Michael found himself standing before Congress, testifying about the importance of systemic change in transportation equity. His testimony wasn't just about aviation. It had become a blueprint for transformation across all sectors of society. The Thompson method, as it came to be known in leadership circles, emphasized the power of dignified response to discrimination. Business schools began teaching the AA-2537 case study alongside other watershed moments in corporate responsibility. Harvard Business Review dedicated an entire issue to examining how one flight attendant's bias, met with grace and wisdom, had catalyzed industry-wide change. Lisa Chen had risen through the ranks to become the airline's chief diversity officer, her journey from that fateful day serving as a powerful reminder that transformation often begins with acknowledging our own prejudices. She regularly shared her story at international conferences, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our most important contributions. The young girl who had drawn the brown-skinned pilot was now entering her final year of flight school. Her story had inspired a documentary titled Brown Crayons, Blue Skies, which followed several young aviators of color as they pursued their dreams. The film had won awards at Sundance and sparked conversations about representation in aviation that reached far beyond the industry itself. Dr. Margaret Chen's book had spawned a whole genre of literature examining everyday moments of transformation. Academic researchers studied what they called the AA-2537 effect, how dignified responses to discrimination could create lasting institutional change. The elderly professor had lived to see her analysis of that flight become required reading in sociology programs worldwide. The airline's training center had been renamed the Thompson Center for Aviation Excellence. Its halls lined with artifacts from Flight AA-2537, the napkin notes, the crayon drawing, photographs of the crew. But more importantly, its classrooms were filled with faces that reflected the true diversity of the world's populations. The sight would have brought tears to Michael's father's eyes. Michael himself had become more than just a pilot, or even an advocate. He had become a symbol of what was possible when dignity met discrimination head-on. Yet he remained as grounded as ever, still finding joy in the simple act of flying, still treating each flight as an opportunity to touch lives and change perspectives. The young executive's corporate training company had expanded globally, with offices in 30 countries. Their pioneering work in bias recognition and intervention had spread far beyond aviation, influencing industries from healthcare to education. He often credited that flight for opening his eyes to the power of active allyship. Airlines worldwide had adopted policies that went beyond mere non-discrimination to active inclusion, Recruitment efforts targeted underrepresented communities, mentorship programs flourished, and the skies increasingly reflected the diversity of the earth below. The change was so profound that younger aviation professionals could hardly believe there was a time when seeing a pilot of color caused surprise. The hashtag dignity at 35,000 feet had evolved into a global foundation, providing scholarships for aspiring pilots from marginalized communities. Each year, they honored a new class of Thompson Fellows, young aviators committed to carrying forward the legacy of dignity and transformation. Lisa's training program had been adapted into a virtual reality experience, allowing participants to feel the weight of that moment when bias confronted dignity. The simulation had become a powerful tool for empathy building, used not just in aviation but in professional development programs worldwide. On the anniversary of Flight AA-2537, airlines across the globe observed Dignity Day, a time for reflection and recommitment to the principles of inclusive aviation. The day wasn't marked by grand ceremonies, but by quiet moments of acknowledgement and thousands of small acts of conscious inclusion. The contrails that crisscrossed the skies now told a different story, not just of human technological achievement, but of human social evolution. Each vapor trail represented not just a journey through space, but a journey toward understanding. Each flight a step closer to the world Michael's father had dreamed of. As Michael prepared for another flight, he noticed a young black girl watching him with wide eyes as he walked through the terminal. Her mother, catching his glance, explained that her daughter had just read about Flight AA-2537 in school. The girl clutched a toy plane in one hand and a brown crayon in the other. "Tell her," Michael said to the mother, "that the sky has no limits, and neither does she." The words carried the weight of years of progress, of countless lives touched, of barriers broken and horizons expanded. They carried the echo of his father's wisdom about standing ground without losing grace, now amplified by thousands of voices joining in chorus for change. And as he stepped into the cockpit, Michael knew that the story of Flight AA-2537 would continue to soar, carried on the winds of change, inspiring new generations to rise above prejudice with dignity, grace, and the unwavering belief that the sky belongs to everyone. The sun painted the horizon in brilliant hues of hope, and somewhere in the vast blue expanse, the spirit of transformation continued to soar, touching hearts and changing minds, one flight at a time. In an endless journey toward a more inclusive tomorrow, the endless journey toward a more inclusive tomorrow took an unexpected turn when Michael received an invitation from the International Space Station program. NASA had been following the transformation in aviation and saw an opportunity to extend these principles beyond Earth's atmosphere. The story of Flight AA-2537 was about to reach new heights, quite literally. The space program had been grappling with its own challenges of inclusion and representation. Michael's approach to transforming the aviation industry offered a blueprint for making space exploration more accessible and equitable. This testimony before Congress had caught the attention of space agency administrators worldwide. The Thompson Center for Aviation Excellence began collaborating with NASA's Diversity Initiative, creating a pipeline program that would help underrepresented groups access opportunities in both aviation and space exploration. The center's success in transforming airline culture made it an ideal partner for reshaping humanity's approach to the final frontier. Lisa Chen found herself consulting with international space agencies, helping them understand how the lessons from AA-2537 could be applied to astronaut training and selection. Her journey from that moment of bias to becoming a catalyst for change had proven that transformation was possible at any scale. The young girl with the brown crayon, now a certified pilot, had set her sights on becoming an astronaut. Her story continued to inspire others, showing how a single moment of recognition, seeing someone who looked like you in a position of authority, could launch dreams beyond the atmosphere. Michael's father's wisdom about standing ground without losing grace began appearing in unexpected places, quoted in space mission guidelines, referenced in international cooperation protocols, even painted on the wall of a new space station module. A simple truth had transcended not just cultural boundaries, but planetary ones. As Michael prepared for his role in training the next generation of spacebound pioneers, he reflected on how far the ripples from that one flight had spread. The principle of dignity at 35,000 feet was being adapted for dignity at 250 miles above Earth's surface. where international crews would need to work together beyond the boundaries of nationality, race, or gender. The Thompson method had evolved into a comprehensive framework for handling discrimination in high-stakes environments. Space agencies recognized that the psychological challenges of long-duration spaceflight required crew members who could handle differences with the same grace and dignity that Michael had demonstrated. The documentary, Brown Crayons, Blue Skies, was being updated with a new chapter, following its subjects as they moved from aviation into space exploration. The young aviators' stories were inspiring a global audience to dream beyond traditional boundaries, their aspirations now reaching to the stars. The virtual reality training program developed from Lisa's experience had been enhanced to include scenarios specific to space missions. Astronaut candidates from around the world experienced simulations that challenged their biases and taught them to handle differences with dignity and respect. The hashtag Dignity at 35,000 Feet Foundation expanded its mission to include support for aspiring astronauts from underrepresented communities. The Thompson Fellows Program now had graduates working in space agencies across the globe, each carrying forward the legacy of transformation through dignified resistance. Dr. Margaret Chen's analysis of Flight AA-2537 had become required reading not just in aviation and sociology programs, but in astronaut training as well. Her insights into how moments of bias could become catalysts for positive change were proving invaluable in preparing humans for the challenges of space exploration. As Michael walked through the NASA training facility, he passed a wall of photographs showing the increasing diversity of space program participants. Among them was a familiar face, the young executive from AA-2537, now a key architect of international space cooperation protocols. The spirit of transformation that had begun in the cabin of a commercial airliner had found its way to the stars, carried on the dreams of those who refused to be limited by earthly prejudices. The contrails that had once marked the path of change were being replaced by rocket trails, reaching higher and farther than ever before. And somewhere, in a classroom on Earth, another child was drawing a picture, this time, of a diverse crew of astronauts standing before their spacecraft, brown crayon in hand, dreams unlimited by atmosphere or expectations. The journey that began at 35,000 feet continued upward, carrying humanity's hopes for a more inclusive future beyond the blue skies into the black of space. The sun still painted the horizon in brilliant hues of hope, but now those colors reached beyond Earth's atmosphere, touching the dreams of a new generation of explorers who understood that the greatest journeys begin not with a single step, but with a single moment of dignity, grace, and unwavering belief in the power of transformation.